I've got a really great subject for you today, and I was really looking forward to bringing you this because it's something that I've been thinking about and coming across quite a lot. And it's something that we don't always think about when we encounter or when we hear about people who are suffering the effects of trauma. Hi, Reka. Nice to see you again. That's why I've got my glasses on so I can see people as they join. And by the way, if you do join, please join in. I'd like to see your comments. I can read them because I've got my glasses on. And then I can answer your questions and make this personal to you too, which is what I really want to do. So what I was saying was one of the things we really don't think about with people with trauma is that we think about the normal things. So let's think about sexual abuse here. And when we hear about this, our reaction is, oh my God, that must have been terrible for you. And maybe we don't understand and think about the specifics, um, like, how scared they were, how they felt like they had no control, how violated they were, all those kind of things that are associated with that kind of trauma. But there's another side to that. And I think that unless we stop and think about this and someone makes you aware, even the client isn't always aware that there is a huge amount of grief. So a lot of the emotion that really gets caught up in this is grief. And the grief is twofold. So there's the grief for the person that they now can't be because of what's happened to them. But before that, there's a grief about what was. And there's a grief about the loss. And for a child who suffers sexual abuse, or even going into their teens, or anyone, but in particular for a child, because they're so vulnerable and they have no power, no choice, no voice, and that's how they feel, what they grieve is for what they didn't have. And it's for the relationship that they didn't have with the person who abused them. Because so often, as we know, these people aren't strangers. This isn't stranger danger. This is the people that a child is either living with or a relative that they have proximity to that abuses that position. And what the child should expect with that person is a light, a fun, a loving relationship, a supportive relationship. And particularly if that is a parent and what they get instead is abuse, then obviously part of what affects them, even if they don't know it as children because they don't know the difference, part of what has to affect them at some point is the grieving for what they didn't have, for the love they didn't have, the support they didn't have, for the birthdays, the hugs, the kisses, the affirmations, the praise. And when you put all this together, it's a huge part of someone's life that's missing. And it has to be grieved at some point. So there's all of that, there's that grief there. So that's what the grief around trauma is. But then later on, there's going to be the grief around who they now can't be, what they can't do, what they didn't do, what they don't have, the relationships that they can't have, the love they can't give and the love they can't receive, and the things they feel about themselves because of what has happened. I touched on this yesterday. And when someone suffers abuse, obviously it fundamentally changes who they are. It changes their perspective on life and on themselves and on the people around them. And then when they start to go through a healing process, or even when they observe other people, there's a grief. There's a grief around what they didn't have. Because if you are someone who sees marriage or relationships or parenting in a certain way, and suddenly you see people around you who are doing it in a totally different way, that is more successful, more loving, more giving, more everything than what you experienced, there's going to be an enormous amount of grief around that. What I didn't have. And if you're looking at a couple's relationship and saying, look what she can do because of the way he supports her. And if you've been through sexual abuse and you don't have that, or if you're watching someone who has an amazing relationship with their parents and you know what your relationship with your parents is, and you're watching that, an enormous part of you is going to be sitting, looking and thinking, I wish I had that. I would love to experience that. I wish that was part of my life. So you see, there are these stages and these sections where for someone who has suffered abuse, and it's not just sexual, I know that's what I focus on, but when we look at domestic abuse, we look at physical abuse and emotional abuse, which is so huge. The scale of it is just, it's unimaginable. And who these people can't be. Even things that they can't say, they can't imagine, places they can't go, noises they can't hear, experiences they can't have, and triggers that they have. And as people start to realize and process these things and compare them to what is more normal, there's a huge grief around that. So I just wanted to make everyone aware that when we hear about someone who goes through any kind of trauma, it's good to be aware that a lot of what they're dealing with is a grieving process. Okay, so that's the what. And then there's the why. You really, really need to heal from this grief and to recognize it. Because what happens if you don't heal from grief, it's just like the grief of someone dying. And it starts to take up an enormous amount of space within you. And that's the grief, if you don't process it and recognize it. And we see this all the time. Next time you see someone who's been abused and they're really, really angry, they're not processing the hurt. They're not processing, well, entirely understandable that they're angry. That anger comes from hurt. And if you don't process the grief around the hurt and don't recognize that, then you're not going to process that hurt and you're just going to stay angry. So whatever emotion the grief is causing, it's so important to do the work, take the time to recognize that and to heal from the grief and the other emotions that it's causing. Otherwise, it just affects every area of your life. Funny enough, I actually experienced this a few years ago, and it was very interesting how I realized what was happening, because I don't want to minimize anyone's experience by talking about my grief here over a dog dying, but this is what actually happened to me, but it brought something much more important to my attention, which is what I've just been talking about. So a few years ago, I had a dog. It was the most amazing dog, and it broke my heart when he died. And I remember a few weeks after he died, this very, very intense grief. It was just like a person dying for me. And what happened was I suddenly realized that the feelings that I had, this intense grief, was actually just a more intense version of something that I was feeling every day. And this was an incredible realization for me. I thought, well, this is really, really deep grief. And how can it just be a more intense version of what I'm feeling every day? So I'm just trying to bring these comments down. Oh, hi, Cheryl. Oh, hi, Jonathan. Oh, we've got some great people on here. Oh, brilliant. Okay, well, if you've got any questions, I can see you're commenting. If you've got any questions, please pop them in. I might lose my train of thought, but that's okay. We can always come back. And I just want to make it relevant to you. But what I was sharing there was about how my grief over my dog made me realize that I had this overriding feeling of grief in my life. And when I was processing it and trying to work out what it was, I realized that it was all related to all of these issues that I'd been carrying through my adult life or through my teen life about being bullied at school and everything that that had been to me and what it had stopped me doing with my life. So it's no secret. I talk about this, I speak about it, how I really wasn't the person I was meant to be for a very long time. And it's only really the last few years that I've developed all my therapy and coaching skills and everything else. And it was all because of this bullying in my background. And I wonder how different that would have been for me if I'd had access to the kind of resources and knowledge that I now have, and I have been able to let that go. Because even after I started to recognize it, it was still with me. And I realized that every day I was carrying some kind of thoughts and feelings about how it had affected me and my lost time. And that was so much better for me once I was able to recognize that. And I moved on so much faster once I could recognize it and let it go. So we need to heal our grief, otherwise it ties us up in so many ways. It spoils our relationships with other people. And don't confuse healing from your grief with forgiveness. You don't have to forgive your abuser. If you want to, that's great. You don't have to forgive your abuser in the way of loving them, appreciating them, and wanting some kind of relationship with them. You just have to, I think it's better to say you have to grieve, and you have to let that go. You have to grieve so you can let the anger go. You have to grieve so you can let the hurt go. Because the important thing about that is, if you think about my situation with the bullying at school, that wasn't hurting any of those. But the grief and the resentment and the hurt that I was still carrying was hurting me. So practice forgiveness for yourself. But don't confuse it with needing to forget and having an obligation to have some kind of relationship. You don't have that kind of obligation and responsibility to anyone. Your obligation and responsibility is to yourself, and healing and grieving in a way that is beneficial to you. Now, how do we grieve and let go? So the way we do this is to recognize, I hope I don't get lost here, this is quite complex, this issue. Might have to refer to some notes. So what we have to do to grieve is to recognize, and I'll give you two examples of clients and it will make this clear for you. Recognize that what we are holding on to, what we are not grieving for and letting go, is an illusion. Now just think about that, because so many people who are in this situation, I've already told you how they're focusing on what they didn't have, the relationship they now can't have with their parents. Let's focus on that one. Let's make that the focal point here, so we've got something to refer to. So if you are holding on to any thoughts, any possibilities about this relationship, this situation being different, wanting to go back, relive things, wishing things could be different, and hoping that they will be really, really different in the future, you're holding on to an illusion. And the illusion is keeping you stuck and stopping you moving on from what is actually reality. Now, I hope that makes sense. And I'm going to explain to you about two clients that I worked with where we had exactly this situation. So I recently worked with a woman who had sexual abuse in her background, and she had tremendous anger problems. It was ridiculous when you saw how she behaved. And I actually termed it as she was behaving like a child. Now that's understandable, because what I know is that anger is always rooted in hurt, and obviously normally what I have in front of me is an adult presenting, but a hurt child emotionally. So it made absolute sense. But the really, really interesting thing was that what she didn't know until we did our scene work under hypnosis, she didn't realize, and this was a feeling that she had very clearly, and she said to me, she was talking about her childhood, and I was telling her that she needed to let it go. And she said, I can't, because then that means that I can't relive it. And this was very, very telling for me. And we really did some work on this. And what she was holding on to was the desire to not have the childhood that she had, but to stay a child so that she could recreate it. This was absolutely phenomenal. We would never have got there in the logical mind. It was what her subconscious showed her, and it made total sense to her. You see, because once we got to that point, what we could do together, I mean, she was the one that said, oh wow, I know I can't do this. I can't relive my childhood. Why am I holding on to this? And once we got to that point, she realized that it was an illusion. So she was holding on to an illusion of something that just couldn't be. But it was fantastic, because the way we could turn that round then, we got her then to understand that the childhood that she didn't have, and everything that she wanted to recreate in that childhood, she could recreate for her own children. And this was absolutely, I tell you, she absolutely blossomed when she realized that if she could let go of the anger, let go of the illusion, and move on, what she could do is recreate what she wanted, what she didn't have, for her children. And the amazing thing about this was she did it there and then. I tell you, as we were talking about it, in that session, she physically changed. She was there all hunched up and all really sad, and honestly, as we spoke about this, she just blossomed. It was amazing. And she said afterwards she just felt this enormous weight lifted. She came out of the session. She had been completely obsessed with her childhood, and she didn't even realize that it was because she wanted to recreate it, and she let it go. And from then on, her absolute focus was on creating what she wanted for her children. And that, to me, that was absolutely amazing that we achieved that. And another one I did was with a girl who had narcissistic parents. And she was really, really, throughout our session, she was absolutely insistent. It was amazing, because she had a drinking problem, she had a weight problem, and literally within the first couple of sessions, we did loads of resolution around those. But what she couldn't let go of, and she kept going back to, and it was really messing her up, she kept going back to trying to have a relationship with her narcissistic parents. And she would do things for them. She was constantly trying to get their approval. So she was always disappointed because it didn't happen. They didn't love her. They didn't appreciate her. They didn't praise her. She couldn't get anything back from them, no matter what she did. And she was absolutely caught up in trying to be what they needed. And she never could. She was never going to get there. She was never going to win. And then one day, we actually spoke about gaslighting. We were talking about gaslighting. That's how it came about. And I was showing her how they were gaslighting her. And you could see that she shifted. And then she suddenly said, so what I want from them is an illusion. Yes, it's an illusion. And it was absolutely amazing for her to get to the point of understanding that what she wanted what she was holding on to, what was taking up so much space inside her, was an illusion of a relationship that was never going to be. She couldn't heal it, and she let it go. And she let it go like that after years of holding on to it, years of torment, years of struggle. And I'll never forget when she messaged me a few days later and just told me how amazingly powerful this had been for her, letting go of this illusion. She'd done all her grieving along the way, and she instantly knew, and she was changed completely. So there you are. So we've got the what, which is your grief, and what are you grieving for, and the why you're grieving. And then we've got the why you need to heal because of its effect on you. And then we've got the how. And I just love the how. I love the how because in hypnosis, it's so easy. In the work that I do, it's easy to get there. It's easy to see, and it's easy to understand. We can immediately show the mind that this is an illusion. So how you grieve and let go is to recognize that it's an illusion. It's not something that's ever going to be, and it's not worth wasting any more time on. What has happened to you has already stolen so much of your time, your life. Don't find and recognize this illusion and let it go.